I think our cancer experiences have the ability to bring us more fully alive in every moment that we are alive.
Welcome to Cancer Talks, a podcast sharing personal stories of transformation from people whose lives have been touched by cancer. My name is Cheryl Buck, and I will be guiding today's conversation. Today's guest is Kristi Nelson, author of a new book, Wake Up Grateful, the transformative practice of taking nothing for granted. She is also the executive director of a Network for Grateful Living, an organization founded by the Benedictine monk Brother David. Hi, Kristi.
Hi, Cheryl. So nice to be here with you.
Oh, it's wonderful to have you here. How are you doing? And let me just answer that for you. I'm sure that you're doing absolutely fabulous. That's one of the things that I've come to learn about you.
I am doing really well. And I'm super grateful for this opportunity. It feels like a big privilege to me. So thank you for inviting me to join you.
That's so sweet. Well, I am also very grateful for this opportunity and truly honored that you have offered to have this conversation with me for Cancer Talks. So
Thrilled.
Thank you for that.
May it serve.
Yes.
So it's an amazing thing to get to talk about an experience that has been this formative in my life, and yet I don't talk about very much anymore. So I'll just say that. It's really an honor. Yeah.
Well, one of the things that you have said to me in the past few weeks that we've been talking about this is that you didn't think, or you said, it doesn't seem like there is anyone tending to these stories. And I love that word, tending. Honestly, that is a big part of what we're doing. So I appreciate that you said that, and now I feel like we're fulfilling something that is missing and I think needed and wanted in the world.
I agree. And I will just comment on that by saying, I think a lot of us go through a cancer journey not in isolation, but in a constellation of a community, a chosen community of healthcare practitioners and family and friends. And we navigate these amazing journeys. And yet there's not a holding space for those as much, and to be a source of inspiration for people and a source of hope. And so I think it's really awesome. And I think the word tending is great. I'm glad I said that because I love it as an expression of attention, right? So attention is tending. And so what we pay attention to, it feels really powerful. And so, thank you for doing this. And I'm really excited to be part of this conversation. So my cancer story is that I was diagnosed at the age of 33 with stage 4 atypical lymphoma. And what that means is the typical presentation of Hodgkin's lymphoma was never present. And yet it didn't also conform to the non-Hodgkin's lymphoma diagnosis and pathology that they were looking for at the time. But by the time I was conclusively diagnosed with that inconclusive diagnosis, which I want to say about cancer is often like, here's the deal. Cancer is there is no kind of normal cancer. I just don't think it's really that true. Everybody, like, cancer is in and of itself atypical. So I like calling, there's no typical cancer because it's about cells going rogue, in some ways. So I will say for myself, very few people say, I had this really ordinary, customary cancer, it was just so textbook and, nothing deviated from the norms. It's like, well, that's really unusual, actually. So I had a normal cancer in that it was really atypical. So by the time they diagnosed me, I had just turned 33 and I had been sick, profoundly sick, for 9 months at least.
Wow.
I think it was closer to 10, like 9 months. I was in the hospital much of that time because how my cancer manifested was originally through spiking fevers and just these outrageous fevers of unknown origin. And that kept me hospitalized for many, many weeks
Wow.
at a time. And what happened was I was misdiagnosed many times in that journey because spiking fevers can mean so many things. So I was kind of passed back and forth between infectious disease and oncology and hematology and a whole variety of things. And at the time, HIV was really prevalent in New York City where I was living. And so, they had so many suspicions about so many things. But meanwhile, the cancer was kind of doing its own stealth growth through my body and ended up in my spine. So by the time I was diagnosed, I had been very sick for 9 months and I was increasingly debilitated because it was metastasizing into my spine. And at the time, we thought that maybe, this is because I've been bedbound. I had been a very active person, but it was in my lumbar spine, turns out. And so I had part of my lumbar spine removed at Mass General Hospital. I ended up, moving back up into Massachusetts once I got sicker and sicker. And then I ended up Mass General, thank God, in the hands of an incredible orthopedic oncologist who put me back together again with, rods and screws and wires and fused me all up. And then I went through a big old, both conventional and complementary treatment journey. After having had, I think it was 11 surgeries. So
oh my gosh.
By the time I was done with all of that hospitalization and surgery, it had been, close to 10 months. And then I started chemotherapy and radiation. And that was very aggressive and was 8 months. And by the time I got done with that, it was November 1993, late November 1993. And I was during that time also doing a lot of nutritional therapy and botanical therapy and herbal treatments and vitamin therapy and Tibetan herbs and acupuncture and Chinese medicine and teas of every kind. And I was doing all the complementary things I could possibly do to help ameliorate the side effects of the chemotherapy and radiation, and also to keep my body really strong, my immune system strong, to be able to deal with the cancer, both the cancer and the treatment. And then, basically I got done with all of that. And the head of oncology at the hospital where I was said, now we want to do a prophylactic bone marrow harvesting because we want to set you up for a bone marrow transplant at the end of all that. And I just said, okay, whoa, no, I'm done. This has now been so long and I won't. And, it was an interesting thing. So long journey. I didn't do that. Instead, I said, I want to live my life. And so I want to just take care of myself. And so, I expected, what they told me was 3 years probability of recurrence is extremely high. And ultimately I was told, even though I, shut my ears to it, the probability of surviving a recurrence, given being stage 4 diagnosis, was very low. So I just started living. And I haven't looked back. Well, I have looked back, but it's been 28 years. 27 and a half years. 27 and a half years now. Yeah.
Yes. So when did you come into the gratitude part of your journey? Was that during this period of time that you just described?
Absolutely.
It was.
Absolutely.
At what point did you say, I'm not going to take anything for granted anymore?
Pretty immediately, actually, because given the likelihood, so back again to what we were saying before about poignancy. So I define poignancy as the awareness of the limitation of time in the face of meaningful experience and realizing the preciousness of life. So that makes life poignant. And so everything was poignant to me after I got through treatment. Everything was so vivid and so extraordinary and excruciating at the same time because of the possibility of losing it. So I was just, all my cells were awake and I didn't want to sleep. I was like, I've got life, I've got this day, I've got this moment,
Wow.
I've got this love. I want to, I just want to live and love out loud. I want to know what matters to me. It was extraordinary to be alive, to get the chance to be alive.
Yes.
After so long, in some ways, befriending the possibility of my own death. And then every day I got to live was just a miracle.
Yeah.
And so I'm not going to say it stayed that way, but to me, for a long time, it was that way. And then what happened for me, Cheryl, was the longer I lived, at some point I started forgetting. The longer I lived, the more I started taking life for granted again, and the more I started forgetting what mattered the most to me. And so honestly, that's where the practice of taking nothing for granted and the practice of living gratefully, that's where it started, which was in earnest, I would say a bunch of years after my treatment, because I got back into a job, I got back into a lot of responsibilities and commitments. I got back into commuting. I got back into, the things that would drive me crazy and worrying about my weight and worrying about this and that. And all the things that I swore would never overtake me as concerns again overtook me.
Yes, exactly.
And that was normal. It was like, oh my gosh, here I am. I'm back to normal living, but this isn't so great. I'd rather figure out how to go back to living acutely again.
Yes.
That's what I call acute living. Like, it's all angels dancing on the head of a pin. It's all vivid.
Yes.
Your cells are alive. You're on fire. Everything, taking nothing for granted is such an extraordinary way to live. And I realized I had to develop methods and means and practices for returning to that poignancy and that awareness. And that became my journey. And then I found a network for grateful living, and Brother David, which basically was the articulation in a slightly different set of kind of languaging and everything, different language and wording and practices. But I found an organization that articulated most deeply this belief and this commitment that I had come to understand was so primal to me. It was so absolutely mandatory to who I was as a human being and how I wanted to go through life. I found a network for grateful living, and I found my kind of spiritual home.
Yes. So I take it that's when you met Brother David?
It was around that time. I was actually working and living with Lynn Twist and in San Francisco.
Yes.
And Brother David was visiting. And I just was so drawn to him. He was luminous. He had this magnanimous nature, this open-heartedness, and I was so drawn to who he was and how he was. And so we connected deeply, and then I kind of stayed in touch with him for a while, and I signed up for gratefulness.org, which was the website, all of his emails and everything. And then I stayed connected to those. And then not long later, I heard that they were looking for an executive director, and 3 different people sent me the job posting within a short period of time and said, I think this is meant for you. I wasn't looking for a job at the time. And I said, okay, if I'm going to be, doing something with the rest of my life, this is what I want to do.
Yes.
And so that's where I have ended up. And this is both, it's my professional home and my spiritual home and the heart of what matters to me, my heart home.
Yes. It was you, I see you paying attention to what was being put in front of you.
Yes. Yes.
And not letting it slip away. Yes. Exactly.
Yes. And being available and I just got goosebumps, making ourselves available for opportunity and possibility.
Yes.
Being open to listening for the invitations that life is extending us all the time.
Yes.
And that is what grateful living is. Grateful living is being completely awake and aware enough in the moment to recognize the invitations of life in all our moments and to respond accordingly when we are offered something that is extraordinary and life affirming. And to also be able to discern, right? So it helps with discernment when we're really awake. And so I feel so blessed and also so thankful that I could say yes to something that felt so aligned, and just lean in and jump into the water.
Right, exactly. That is a lesson to us all. It's only been about 3 months, I think. We met on a Zoom call in, I think it was January, and you were a guest speaker for a program that I was attending called Peaceful Exit. And it's a program where we really look at planning a peaceful exit from the world when our time has come, and when we've planned for it. What I say is, creating my peaceful exit makes for a peaceful life.
Totally.
So anyway, I'm forever indebted to Sarah Kavanaugh for coming up with this and for introducing you and I.
Me too.
So I heard, you spoke, and Sarah asked you to tell your death story. And in Peaceful Exit, we've really taken the charge off of the word death, about thinking about death. We've talked about it. And so I say it here, hopefully it doesn't scare people.
No, it's so cool, actually, to think about it. Yeah.
Right. So I'd love to hear your death story. And I wanted to just say one thing that comes to mind so I don't forget about it is when you're going to be talking about Brother David, and his teacher, I think you would say, was Saint Benedict. And Saint Benedict said, "Keep death always before our eyes."
Yes.
And then you said, "When I forget I'm mortal, I take my life for granted."
Yeah, when I forget that my life is mortal and that I join the human race in being mortal,
Yes.
I take everything for granted.
Yes.
So much more. And that's really part of what my story is about. So I moved then to start with this piece of, so there's a pivotal intersection point between Brother David's life and my life. And that is that we both faced our mortality in our youth. And Brother David lived through the Second World War, spending a lot of his time with other young people in church basements and in safe places where they could harbor against the bombs that were dropping. And what Brother David realized that was when he would come outside and still be alive and face the blue sky, the sky had never seemed more blue, and the joy in his heart had never seemed more significant. And so what he realized was the sense of holding the possibility of not being alive made him feel more alive. And this is a very powerful teaching and a challenging teaching, because in our culture, we're taught basically to deny death. So
Right.
it's a big contradiction to that. And so when he aged and grew into his 20s and was exposed, he was such a scholar, a religious scholar and everything, and he was exposed to St. Benedict. He decided to spend his life as a Benedictine monk based on St. Benedict's saying that's so powerful as a guiding precept in life, which is keep death at all times before your eyes. And that invitation for Brother David was so powerful and resonated so much with his experience of having been young and knowing the great aliveness that came out of accepting ourselves as mortal, that he spent his life now as a Benedictine monk, which is just amazing. And so what do I have in common with that? Very little. I'm anything but a monk. But in my early 30s, I had a cancer experience that had me face death very squarely. And death was in front of my eyes for quite a long time. And I kept death before my eyes. And when I did, my experience of life was that it was so acute and vivid and so rich, and my aliveness was so full that when I forgot, about my mortality, the longer I kept living after cancer. And I had that experience of kind of getting folded back into life as it is and all the busyness and stresses of a regular life of a young person. And I forgot about that. My aliveness went away. And so what I realized was that it was critical to develop and hold perspectives, Cheryl, that helped us reconnect with the parts of that principle or precept about remembering death can bring us more alive. How can we not take life for granted? That became my question. And I knew that whenever I was taking life for granted, I was forgetting that I was mortal. And whenever I forgot that I was mortal, I would take life for granted.
Yes.
So that's been part of my path ever since. And the connection to Brother David and to Grateful Living is really his teaching is so strong because of that shared experience in our early life.
Yes, before you had met each other.
Before we had met, we had our experiences way before we met each other. He was very young, and now he's 95. But so his experience in the Second World War. But I learned about him. I learned about his work before I met him, but I didn't understand what his work was based in. And so then I met him and became much more connected to his work and his teachings. And then, of course, now I run the organization, a network for Grateful Living. So I'm very connected to the teachings. And so I think our cancer experiences have the ability to bring us more fully alive in every moment that we are alive. And that's the challenge, is to dance with this prospect, dance with our journeys, dance with our experience in a way that allows us to come more alive in facing the possibility of the truth of uncertainty, the truth of the fact that we're not going to be here forever. And the more squarely we can hold that, the more close to heart we can hold that, the more powerfully enhanced our experience of living is. So that's the paradox, right?
Yes.
The paradox that you say kind of in Peaceful Exit is, how do we hold the possibility and the truth of our death in such a way that it brings us more alive? It's really possible.
Would you like to share your death story now?
Yeah, well, and my death story is kind of long. It's interesting because what I'll say about it that I think is so cool, Cheryl, is I had never told my death story before I told it on Peaceful Exit with your group. I never even thought about myself as having a death story. It was so illuminating and so enlightening.
Wow.
And so what I realized, and this was at Sarah Kavanaugh's invitation, was that we all are imprinted with death stories in our lives when we're born, in many ways, and throughout our lives when we're unaware of it, by our parents' relationship to death in their lives, and to their parents' relationship to death in their lives. And so that our ancestry informs our death story so much. And I had never really thought about that before to the degree that I did when I came and shared with the group.
Yes.
But my critical in my story is a lot of death at young ages. So I think that's something that's really interesting, a lot of facing of death at young ages, because my mother's mother died when she was 32 or 34. And she died of an atypical, what we think is a thymus-based lymphoma, which is what then my mother was diagnosed with at 24, and I was diagnosed with at 33.
Oh my gosh.
So we had a 3-generation atypical lymphoma history of women in their young years. And my mom's history with that, both in her own life and losing her mom at the age of 11, was so pivotal, and how that shaped my experience of death. And I think just to be honest, what I inherited from that lineage was the idea that death was about betrayal and abandonment, that you would betray the people you loved. Because my mom had 3 kids. She had 3 of us when she was diagnosed at 24. And my mom's mom left their life. So betrayal and abandonment was on one side. And then for my dad, his mom died in her 40s when I was very young. And he was on a plane in transit to get back to see her, and she died while he was on his way to see her, and he never saw her in those last times of her life. We were living across the country from her. And from my father losing his mother to cancer again, so cancer being so prevalent in my family death story, it was a tragedy. Death was so tragic in my father's life, and that how he experienced it was such an acute loss. And I think that lived as those cancer stories lived as a shadow over our experience of growing up in the family with my parents in a really big way, and imprinted how I experienced the possibility of death. And so my death story, when it comes to more personal, so powerfully, and I think this is so important to think about, is what do we need to overcome and what do we need to befriend in befriending the possibility and the truth of our own death. And for me, it was acceptance in the face of the idea of my death would be a betrayal to people. My death would be an abandonment of people, including my mother, who had suffered so much and survived her own death at near death at 24, and had lived so fiercely for us children. So the prospect of dying in my 30s was devastating to her and to my father, devastating to them. And yet I needed to make a place in my journey for my own death and for the prospect of my own death, and to make a peaceful place to navigate that experience in its own right, in my own heart, in my own body, in my own mind, to come to that befriending place. And that was the charge laid out to me by my family death story and the ancestry and what I inherited and was imprinted by. And it was so critical for me to come to understand that.
Yes.
And that the befriending was in the face of all of that energy. And then it felt like I could bring peace to my family's story by how I made a relationship with death.
Wow, that's beautiful.
For everyone who's dealt with cancer and for everyone who's going to deal with death, which is all of us, it's so important to understand what you believe about death.
Yes.
Before that happens, and before, as you lose the people you love, to come to a place that is as reconciled and as well thought through and as befriended and peaceful and open-hearted as you possibly can.
Yes. Well, how would you recommend or suggest that someone get to that point to reconcile with their, their death, their belief, their belief system?
Yeah.
About death?
I think that's a challenging question. I also think it's like the $1 million question here, which is, how do we live well and live large into all possibility with the awareness of our mortality front and center? And how do we continue to remind ourselves of that and not just be depressed all the time?
Yeah.
Or not be absolutely undone by it. And so for me, I have flipped it in a way, and it's the title of the book and everything, is how the practice of taking nothing for granted.
Yes.
So I think that's the way in for me. My suggestion is to, as we go through life, to ask ourselves, what if I didn't take for granted that there was a tomorrow?
Mm-hmm.
What if I didn't take for granted that I've got 10 years to live the life I want to live, to love the people I want to love, to do the things I care about doing, to be the person I want to be? Mm-hmm. What if I didn't assume and expect almost anything?
Yes.
What if I could be so fully here, so fully present now, and not take the future for granted, that it could enrich my life, that it could motivate and move me so much in the moment towards that which I love, towards that which I'm grateful for, and to be so much more fully alive in the face of that? That's, to me, the exciting proposition, which is actually just the truth, right? So the truth is none of us do know. And the truth is there are bazillions of people, that's a number, I think, actually, bazillions of people who are not here today who thought they would be.
Yes.
So how do we honor the people we've loved and lost? How do we honor all the people who have lost their lives, except for to say, I will live more fully with the awareness of impermanence so that I can honor life in the ways that so many other people would have loved to.
Wow. That's just beautiful. Before I break out into a complete sob fest, I just want to share with you that in our talk back last Friday, there was a gentleman there who is going to have a what he referred to as a minor cancer procedure in a few weeks. And he said, I recognize that I have this disease and I'm either going to survive it or not, but eventually I will succumb to something.
Yes.
And so he said, let's say I say to myself, okay, I have 3 years to live. What do I do with that time when I've just really started to recognize the preciousness of life and the finiteness of life as well? And bottom line, he said, what really matters? Well, I think you've answered his question.
Well, thank you. And I would say the answer to that, Cheryl, is it's such a unique inside proposition for each of us. And that's really the exciting part, is how are you moved to live knowing that you are mortal?
Yes.
And whether it's 3 years, 3 days, 3 weeks, 3 months, or 30 years, how do you take none of that time for granted? And I think that's why, for me, what you're describing, I do think about it all the time, to live with the awareness of the preciousness of life and the brevity of time, or what I would call the unpredictability of time, the surprise of time. Time is a surprise, like the lifespan that's for us, we have no idea, and how life is going to unfold. And what do we do with that, except for, I think, respond to the call, heed the call to become more alive in the face of that. And yet it's difficult. And so for all of us who also struggle with that and who are kind of undone by it initially, like, it's not a quick and easy thing.
Right.
And especially if we have children, if we have families, these are really challenging propositions. If we're young, it's much harder to make this journey. It's a different journey for every single human being.
Right.
And so to honor that is really important. There is no one way and there's no formula for this stuff. But I would say connecting to what matters most is the critical thing. What matters most to each of us, in our hearts, when we really connect, when we, and in my book, which, it's called Wake Up Grateful, and not only does it have a subtitle, it has a title, Wake Up Grateful, the transformative practice of taking nothing for granted. Wake up is that death wakes us up. The prospect of death, losing somebody, almost dying, it's a wake-up call. And when we get that wake-up call, it's often so dramatic, and it wakes us up to what matters most to us. In those crystallized moments of clarity, when you have this wake-up call, the things that matter most, how do we stay awake to those in the day-to-day of our lives without needing those big wake-up calls to remind us? So that's, to me, the cool thing, is staying very deeply connected to having practices, reminding ourselves what matters most to us, and living into that out loud, wholeheartedly, as much and as often as we possibly can, because remembering those things is the path to so much freedom and joy, but forgetting them is the path of regretting. I think we want to reduce the regrets in our lives by remembering what matters the most to us and not having it get lost on us. And that's available to any of us in any moment if we can stay awake to what is most important in our hearts. And so that would be the gentleman who was asking that question. I think it's so powerful. Yes. And I just say, live and love your heart out loud in every way you possibly can. And that's unique to you. Nobody can tell you what that is, but connect deeply to your heart. Find the ways to connect with your heart and your values and your priorities every single day. And you will never be steered wrong if you live your heart out loud.
Wow.
And wouldn't it be great if you get to live really long that way? And it's hard, it's a challenge. You're going to need to keep, the practice has to keep going because our lives and our society wants to pull us off track all the time, honestly. But whether you live 3 weeks that way or 30 years that way, you're going to win. That's a winning life.
Yes.
Doesn't matter how long it is. It's the quality, not the quantity.
Yes. Oh, that's beautiful. Wow. I've just been nodding my head for the last few minutes.
I can't see you, but I'm going to know that you've been nodding your head, and that makes
Nodding
me
my head
joyful.
And smiling.
Oh, good. Oh, good. Smiling and crying. Those are two really good ways of relating. Thank you. My cancer journey taught me about death. And cancer journey also taught me about life. And that's what you're hearing now is, all of the places where those two streams come together, because I didn't die, much to my own surprise and to many people's surprise. What an honor, to be able to have the conversations that matter, to be able to distill the things that life and death have taught us, and to honor the people we've loved who are no longer here, which for many of us is a lot of people who loved life. And to me, this work and living our hearts fully in the face of grief, in the midst of grief, is, I think, the greatest testament to life.
Yes.
And so that's what moves me so much too, is it's in honor of my future self, who will someday, maybe soon, no longer be here. It's in honor of my former self, who learned all of this and is just privileged to have the opportunity to impart the experience, and in honor of everyone who feels this and felt this in their own life and is no longer here to offer the teachings. That's the honor. It's so beautiful and so meaningful. So thank you for having a platform like this that allows people to share what matters most deeply to them.
I want to just say something about your website, and as an entry to living gratefully moment by moment. I've been poring over it the last few days, and it really is, you call it an online sanctuary, and that was absolutely my experience of it. Lighting a virtual candle, watching a video about Brother David and his life, and listening to you talk, listening to people who, you have like hundreds of thousands of followers, from what I can tell, yes, around the world. And watching the Grateful Voices, is that what that
so
video
beautiful.
Series that you guys
Yes.
did? It's just
so amazing.
It is. And anyway, there's just it's so rich in content and in being able to evoke this feeling of gratitude, just by being on your website. So
thank you.
It's gratefulness.org. And also your two books, I want to make sure that you did talk about them. I'm going to say the first one, this is one I'm reading now, is Wake Up Grateful, the Transformative Practice of Taking Nothing for Granted. Wow, what a title.
Thank you. I hope it speaks to people. I feel so lucky to have been able to write it, and it was quite a story to be able to put into print. And thank you for that. And the other one is Everyday Gratitude. Is that the one that you were going to say? Yes.
For living life as a gift.
We try to redefine gratitude, Cheryl, I think, in a way that makes it accessible to people, because it's not just for the moments when everything goes right.
Oh, very good point. Yes. Yes.
Being grateful is for all of life, for every moment of life, for everything in life. That how can we bring an unconditional sense of gratitude alive? And therefore, we have access to all of its gifts and benefits, no matter what's happening.
Yes.
And so that's really the beauty of it. And I want to just mention quickly that right now we have an not an e-course, but an online live course that we just launched this morning.
I saw that this morning. Yes.
I'm so excited. It's called Wake Up Grateful, Open Your Heart to Life. And it's a beautiful, I'm so excited. We're going to start it in May 2021, and it'll be live in May and June. And then it will be on demand starting later in the summer. But if people are interested, it should be a really robust, rich, inspiring journey. We're going to have special guests, including some special guests I'm not going to mention now, but I'm somebody who you know. But special guests to be announced. So, but really, really, really exciting to do this. It's the first time we've done a live course. So I hope some people might consider joining us.
And leading the course is our very own Kristi Nelson. So
c'est moi. It is, yes, I'm very excited about it. I look forward to it very much. And
I do too.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. This has been transformational for me, this conversation with you, Kristi.
I'm so grateful. You make me want to cry.
No, you made me cry.
Thank you, Cheryl. Both and, yes.
Just, this final thought before you were talking about the course is to be grateful for what is.
Yes.
And that is everything. And that is such a beautiful distinction to make, because we do think, I'm going to be grateful because it's my birthday, or I'm getting presents, or, things like that. When being grateful to be alive, moment to moment.
Yes, I think it's what we describe it as is the gratefulness of life. Gratefulness is gratitude for the gratefulness of life. Everything. And when you talk about it, what occurs to me is we're so used to being grateful for the green lights. When we get them, especially when they line up in a long string of them, and we've got like, woo, I could keep going down the road. We're so grateful for the green lights, and that's what we're used to being. But what if we could also be grateful for the red lights and the yellow lights of life?
Right.
That give us the opportunity to stop and to pause before we go. Yeah. And that is the practice of stop, let go, which is the grateful living practice, which is stop, which means you need a red light here and there. And then pause and look and notice. Look around. Pay attention. Tend, right? Tending, what we talked about. Yes. That's the yellow light. And the green light is go. Life is not all about the going.
Yes.
So maybe we can learn to begrudge less the yellow and the red lights of life that stop us and give us the opportunity to learn and to pay attention and to notice. Because then we go with so much more wholeheartedness.
There couldn't be a better way to put it for the way life is today. If you enjoyed this conversation, please leave a review in your podcast app. This podcast is a platform for anyone who has been touched by cancer. Go to cancertalks.com/mystory to join the conversation. If you are moved to donate, please visit patreon.com/cancertalks. This episode was produced by Claire DeLaslo and Rory Amenrud, music and editing by Annie Mernigan, and a special thanks to our donors and volunteers. We couldn't do this without you.